My name is Ulissa Hale. I am 65 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and a widow who spent her life raising a family that once meant everything to me. I taught children for more than 3 decades, guiding their first words on a page, their first numbers on a chalkboard, believing in the power of patience and kindness. I believed the same patience and kindness would carry me through old age. But that belief shattered in a courtroom where my own daughter stood against me. The room was too bright, the fluorescent lights humming above our heads. Every bench was filled with faces, neighbors, journalists, strangers eager to see family ruin turned into spectacle. At the center, Clara sat beside her husband Ethan, their lawyer sharp and polished like a blade. My daughter would not look at me at first, but when her lawyer rose and began to speak of financial incompetence and elderly mismanagement, Clara finally turned. Her voice did not tremble. "She's a burden," she declared, each syllable falling heavy into the silence. "My mother is a burden, and she no longer deserves control over $50 million that belong to this family's future." The words did not echo. They dropped straight into me like stones into water, sinking where once there had been warmth. Burden. A teacher who worked 2 jobs to send her child to college, a widow who sold her jewelry to cover medical bills when Ethan's first business failed, a mother who stayed awake through the long nights of Clara's teenage tears, now reduced to that single word: burden. Their lawyer pressed on, citing documents twisted out of truth. Ethan squeezed Clara's hand like a man rehearsing triumph. The gallery buzzed. I sat alone at my table, not once raising my voice. To the crowd, my silence might have looked like defeat. To Clara, it must have felt like victory. She demanded not just the money, but the dignity I had carried my whole life. $50 million, she said, should be handed to her and her husband, since I was incapable, unstable, too old to matter. The judge's face was unreadable, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose. I could feel the air in the room thicken, heavy with anticipation. Everyone seemed certain that I would crumble, that I would beg or weep or lash out in desperation. I did none of those things. I waited. I had always known this moment would come, though never did I imagine it would come from my own blood. When my time finally arrived, I rose. My knees did not shake. I did not glance at Clara, though I felt her eyes on me, sharp and gleaming. I stepped forward, each heel striking the marble floor like a clock counting down to something inevitable. I carried nothing but a single folded page in my hand. No speeches, no binders of evidence, no rehearsed defenses. Just one paper I had guarded quietly through sleepless nights. I placed it gently on the judge's bench. My voice was calm. "Your Honor, before any ruling is made, I believe this should be read." He looked at me, then at the page. His fingers adjusted his glasses, and he began to read. One line, another. His expression changed like clouds pulling over a sky. First curiosity, then shock, then a cold resolve. He set the page down and raised his head, his voice cutting like iron. "No one moves," he ordered. "Close the doors immediately." The courtroom gasped. The bailiff froze, then hurried to obey. Locks clicked. The echo of metal rang in every chest. Clara's face drained of color. Ethan muttered something, his jaw tightening. Clara tried to rise, but her knees gave way, and she collapsed back into her seat, her hand trembling. And then they came. Federal officers, swift and silent, flooding the aisles in dark uniforms. The sound of boots against the floor, the steady clink of handcuffs ready to close. Panic rustled through the gallery like a wind through dry leaves. The same people who had smirked at me minutes earlier now clutched their coats and whispered frantic prayers. I did not move. I simply stood, watching the walls of lies close in around the very people who had called me a burden. The daughter I once cradled, the son-in-law I once trusted, the family who believed age made me weak, all of them trembling in the shadow of a single sheet of truth. I had waited years for this moment, not for vengeance, but for clarity. And as I stood there, my heart steady in the chaos, I realized this was not just about money or betrayal. It was about reclaiming the dignity they had tried to strip away from me. If you are here with me, listening to my story unfold, I invite you to stay. because what happened in that courtroom was not an ending. It was the beginning of a reckoning that stretched far beyond family walls. Stay with me, and you will see how a mother's silence became her greatest strength, and how one quiet act can change everything. And if stories like this touch your heart, I hope you'll walk this path with me again, because together we are never truly alone. At times I wish the courtroom had been the first place my daughter ever called me a burden. That way, I could pretend it was the heat of litigation, the stress of lawyers whispering in her ear. But the truth is, those words had been seeded long before the judge, long before the headlines. They had slipped into the quiet corners of my own home, and I had heard them enough times to know she meant them. I remember one Sunday morning, the sun soft through the kitchen window, the kettle whistling low. I reached for the heavy pot on the stove, and my hand shook slightly, more from arthritis than fatigue. Clara's voice cut sharp behind me. "Mom, please let me do it. You're too weak. One day you're going to burn the house down." She laughed, but it was not the laugh of affection. It was the sound of dismissal, of someone already certain I was past usefulness. Ethan sat at the table scrolling through his phone, and though he didn't laugh, the smirk that curved at his mouth told me he agreed. Later that week, when I struggled with the groceries, Clara muttered under her breath, "Why do you insist on carrying things? Just order delivery, Mom. You can't keep up anymore." I tried to answer gently, tried to remind her that simple chores kept me feeling alive, but the words barely left my lips before she shook her head. "You need to face reality. You can't handle life the way you used to." Ethan placed his hand on her arm as if to calm her, but his eyes told a different story. They were already calculating, already measuring what my decline could mean for them. One night after dinner, I overheard them in the living room. I had gone upstairs to fold laundry, but their voices carried easily through the floorboards. "She's sitting on everything," Clara whispered. Urgency coiled in her tone. "The house, the accounts, all of it. If we could just get her to sign—" Ethan cut her off, his voice lower but firm. "Don't push too hard yet. One step at a time. You know how fragile she looks. Just one more nudge and it will all fall into place. The property, the savings, it's practically ours already." I froze on the stairs, a shirt limp in my hands. My heart beat slow, heavy, each thud echoing louder than their conversation. I had once prayed for Clara to find someone who would love her, someone who would steady her when I no longer could. Instead, I had found myself listening to the man she married guide her into plotting against me. My daughter's voice dropped to a murmur, but the words burned through the air. "Maybe we should refinance the house in our name. It would be easier that way." That was the moment a line cracked in me. I stood still in the dim hallway, staring at the framed photographs on the wall, the one of Clara at her high school graduation clutching my hand, the one of the three of us smiling around the Thanksgiving table after my husband had passed. Those frozen smiles mocked me. What had I done to raise a child who would look at me and see only leverage? I walked back into the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands lay still in my lap, though I could feel them trembling inside. In all my years as a teacher, I had seen children lash out at their parents. I had heard teenagers declare their mothers ruined their lives, but I had always believed it was temporary, that love and time would soften the edges. Sitting alone in that room, I realized my daughter's words had sharpened with age, not softened. She did not see me as a mother anymore. She saw me as an obstacle to wealth. The next morning, Clara greeted me cheerfully, pouring coffee into my chipped mug, as though nothing had been said. Her brightness felt rehearsed, a mask worn too tightly. I sipped slowly, watching her. Ethan kissed her cheek on his way out the door, his eyes sliding to me once before he left. It was not the look of a son-in-law. It was the look of a man biding his time. I wanted to speak then, to tell her I had heard every word, but I couldn't. My throat locked. My silence had always been my refuge, the place I went when pain cut too deep. So I let it hang between us, that silence. She filled it with small talk, as if we were still mother and daughter sharing an ordinary morning. But beneath her words I could hear the truth. I was no longer a mother in her eyes. I was a hurdle she planned to climb, and with Ethan's encouragement, she had already measured the distance. The morning the envelope arrived, the sky was a dull gray, the kind of color that drains even the promise of warmth from the day. I opened the front door and bent slowly to gather the mail, expecting nothing more than grocery flyers and bills. Instead, resting on top was a large envelope with the county court's seal pressed into the corner. My name, written in neat legal type, seemed to glare back at me. I stood frozen on the porch, my hand gripping the stack until my knuckles whitened. Something in me already knew this was no ordinary document. Inside, at the kitchen table where I had once graded children's essays and helped Clara practice her spelling words, I slit the envelope open. The paper inside was thick, official, impossible to ignore. I read the words once, then again, but they refused to make sense. Plaintiff: Clara Hale. Defendant: Ulyssa Hale. Allegations: misappropriation of family trust funds, undue influence, emotional distress. My daughter was suing me. For a moment the house tilted, the walls seeming to close in. Clara's name, my daughter's name, was printed cleanly as if it belonged to a stranger. I pressed my hand against the table to steady myself. Every sacrifice, every night spent awake beside her bed when she was a child, every dollar I stretched to cover her education was erased in those lines. She had not only called me a burden, she had set the law against me. I don't know how long I sat staring at the page, but by the time I moved, the day had slipped into late afternoon. The news found me before I could even gather myself. A neighbor stopped by, face pale with something between pity and curiosity. "I saw the story," she said softly, unable to meet my eyes. I didn't know what she meant until, later that evening, I turned on the television. There it was, my face on the screen, frozen in an old photograph from my retirement party. The anchor's polished voice reported that I had manipulated family funds, that I was unstable after years of widowhood, that my daughter had bravely stepped forward to protect the family's assets from my supposed decline. Words like misconduct, unfit, and mentally unsound spilled into the air of my living room. Each one landed heavy, like blows from an unseen hand. They displayed a picture of Clara next, her features soft, her eyes brimming with carefully practiced worry. She spoke to a reporter outside the courthouse, her voice trembling. "This was the hardest decision of my life," she said, Ethan's arm protective around her shoulders. "But I couldn't let my mother destroy everything my father built. I love her, but she's not the woman she used to be. We had to act." I gripped the remote until my hand hurt. To the world, she sounded like a dutiful daughter forced into a painful choice. To me, she sounded like a stranger. Ethan nodded beside her, his face set in concern. I had once believed he was shy, but I saw now that it was calculation. Together they played their parts, and the cameras devoured it. By the next morning, the phone rang endlessly. Friends I hadn't heard from in years left cautious messages. "Just checking in. Hope you're okay." Their voices carried the weight of judgment wrapped in politeness. Others did not call at all. At the grocery store, the cashier's smile felt forced. A woman I had known from church turned her card away sharply when she saw me coming down the aisle. Even the librarian, who had once set aside books she thought I'd enjoy, barely nodded in my direction. I felt myself shrinking in those days, as though every whispered headline carved away another piece of who I was. The lawsuit was not just paper. It was a public unmasking, a theater in which my daughter had written me the role of villain. The dignity I had guarded all my life seemed suddenly fragile, one rumor away from crumbling. At night, I reread the complaint, my eyes burning over the words Clara had approved. Unfit to manage finances, prone to erratic behavior, exploited the trust of elderly parents. I wanted to shout into the quiet house that I was none of those things, that I had lived carefully, responsibly, faithfully, but the walls offered no reply. I began to notice the silence of the phone more than the ringing. Friends who once invited me to coffee no longer reached out. Neighbors who had waved for decades kept their eyes on the pavement. It wasn't just the lawsuit that condemned me. It was the way people wanted to believe the story of the failing old woman who had become dangerous to her own family. Perhaps it made them feel safer about their own children, their own aging. One evening, I stepped outside to water the small rosebush by my porch. A pair of teenagers walked past, their voices carrying easily. "That's her," one whispered. "The crazy lady who stole from her own family." They laughed, careless in their cruelty. I stood very still, the hose heavy in my hand, and I felt shame bloom hotter than the water soaking the earth. Inside, the television continued its endless cycle. Sources close to the family report concerns about Yulissa Hale's mental stability. Court documents suggest decades of financial mismanagement. The phrases piled high, and with each one, I felt the floor beneath me sink deeper. Clara and Ethan had given the world a story, and the world had chosen to believe it. But beneath the shame, beneath the sting of betrayal, something else took root in me. It was not anger yet, not even defiance. It was a slow, steady awareness that if I remained silent forever, their story would become the only truth left standing. And though my voice felt lost in the storm, I knew I had not been erased. Not yet. The house was too quiet the night I decided to open the old file cabinet. Sleep had abandoned me, leaving only the weight of the lawsuit and the hollow silence that followed me everywhere. I sat at my desk, with the lamp casting a pale circle of light, papers spread before me like fragments of a life I no longer recognized. Bills, retirement statements, tax returns, all the ordinary proof of years lived carefully. But among them, I found envelopes I didn't remember signing, contracts with my name printed too perfectly, too mechanical. At first I thought it was the stress of age clouding my memory, that maybe I had indeed forgotten something. But the more I looked, the more the details scraped at me. My signature was there, yes, but it felt wrong. The curve of the Y, the slope of the H. It was mine, but not mine, like someone had studied me closely enough to mimic my hand. I followed the trail from one paper to another until I reached a folder labeled Cresvale Group Holdings. The name meant nothing to me. I had never invested in any group, never trusted anyone but a local advisor to handle what little I had. Yet here was an entire folder devoted to it. I opened it slowly, and the contents made my skin run cold. There were incorporation documents filed with the state, bank records, and loan applications worth sums I never would have dared to request. Every single one bore my name as a guarantor. And on the letterhead, 2 names stood out: Ethan Hale, listed as founder and chief executive, and Clara Hale, my daughter, listed as deputy director. The room tilted again, but I gripped the desk until my fingers hurt, forcing myself to steady. I read line after line, each one pulling me deeper into a world I hadn't known they had built around me. Cresvale Group was described as a consultancy firm specializing in asset management and international expansion. In truth, the numbers betrayed them. The addresses were post office boxes, the phone numbers redirected to nowhere, the transactions routed through shell accounts. It wasn't a business, it was a mask. One particular document stopped me cold. A loan application for nearly $2 million, supposedly for expanding Cresvale into new markets, with my name as the primary collateral. The attached note read, "Approved based on guarantors' established assets. My house, my savings, my future, all placed as security without my knowledge." I sat back in the chair, my breath shallow. The betrayal I had felt in court now cut sharper, because this was no longer just about words. This was evidence of deliberate deception, carefully constructed and signed with my stolen hand. I could almost hear Ethan's voice, calm and persuasive, convincing Clara that this was necessary, that her mother's name was simply a tool waiting to be used. And Clara, my daughter, had not only agreed, but had placed herself beside him as deputy, a partner in the scheme. The clock ticked past midnight, the sound too loud in the small room. I pulled more documents free, scanning quickly now, my eyes racing over dates and figures. The pattern was clear. For months, maybe years, they had been building this company on the foundation of my trust. Ethan had orchestrated it, But Clara's signature was there too, bold and practiced, as if she had taken pride in her role. I tried to remember the last time she had hugged me without hesitation, the last time she had asked me how I was instead of how much money remained in my accounts. Those memories felt distant now, like faded photographs. In their place stood the papers in my hands, undeniable proof that love had been traded for greed. I closed the folder slowly, pressing it against my chest, as though I could absorb the truth without it breaking me completely. But the chill in my bones told me otherwise. Nothing in this house was safe anymore, not even my own name. For the first time since the lawsuit, I felt something stronger than grief rising in me. It was suspicion, cold and steady, like the first spark of fire hidden beneath ash. They had used me as collateral, reduced me to a signature, and thought I would never look closely enough to see it. But I had seen it now. Cresvale Group was not a company. It was the mask my daughter and her husband wore while they dismantled my life piece by piece. I turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, the folder still in my hands. The night pressed heavy around me, but inside, a new clarity sharpened. Whatever they had built, I would tear apart, and I would do it quietly, carefully, with the patience of a woman who had spent her life teaching children that every lie, no matter how polished, eventually shows the smudge of ink beneath. There are nights when the past returns without invitation, slipping through the cracks of silence and settling heavily on my chest. One memory more than any other lingers with painful clarity, as though it happened yesterday. It was a cold afternoon in late autumn, the kind where the wind carries the smell of burning leaves and every gust feels like it can strip you bare. Clara was 17, standing on the edge of her future, bright-eyed and eager for the life I wanted so desperately to give her. She had been accepted into a college she dreamed of, but the tuition bill lay heavy on our kitchen table, larger than anything I could manage with my modest teacher's salary. I remember holding the bill in my hands, the numbers blurring as I tried to make them add up. I had stretched every dollar, taken extra shifts tutoring, and even sold furniture I no longer needed. Still, it wasn't enough. That was the day I walked into a small pawn shop downtown with my wedding ring wrapped in tissue paper. The gold had dulled with time, the diamond tiny but precious, a symbol of the life I once built with my husband before he was gone. My fingers trembled as I laid it on the counter. The man behind the glass didn't look at me twice. He weighed it, appraised it, and slid the cash across as if it were nothing more than metal and stone. I remember stepping out into the cold air, clutching the bills in my pocket, and feeling both hollow and relieved. I told myself it was worth it, that love was not measured in rings or glittering stones, but in what we sacrificed for the people we cherished. When I handed Clara the tuition payment later that evening, she stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. "Where did this come from?" she asked, her voice almost fearful. I tried to brush it off. "I found a way. That's all you need to know." She pressed me, and finally I told her. I told her about the pawn shop, about the ring. Her face broke into sorrow, and she wrapped her arms around me so tightly I could feel her heart racing. "Mom," she whispered into my shoulder, "I promise you, one day I'll take care of you the way you've always taken care of me. I'll never let you feel alone when you're older. You'll never have to worry. That's my promise." Her words poured into me like sunlight, warming the hollow place left by the loss of that ring. I held her as if my arms could freeze the moment in time, as if love spoken aloud could shield us from the uncertainty ahead. For years I carried that memory like a treasured keepsake, believing it was proof that no matter what storms came, the bond between mother and daughter was unbreakable. Now, when I sit in silence and hear the echo of Clara's voice in the courtroom calling me a burden, the memory cuts deeper than any accusation. How could the same girl who once swore she would protect me now look at me as nothing more than an obstacle? The image of her teenage face, tearful and full of gratitude, collides with the cold expression she wears today, rehearsed and detached. I cannot reconcile the two, yet they both exist inside her. The daughter who promised care and the woman who plots to take everything from me. I think often of that ring. Sometimes late at night, I can almost feel the weight of it still pressing against my finger, the smooth band worn by years of life and work and love. It was never expensive, never extravagant, but it was a piece of me. To give it up felt like carving away a part of myself for Clara's future, and she knew it. She knew exactly what it meant when she promised she would be there for me. Memory can be cruel. It does not fade kindly when the present contradicts it. Instead, it sharpens the edges, forcing you to see the contrast more starkly. I wish I could forget her promise, that night in our worn little kitchen when she swore I would never be alone. But forgetting would be easier than remembering, and I do not have the luxury of erasing what is carved into my heart. I sit now surrounded by documents that prove her betrayal, by headlines that paint me as unstable, and yet it is not the papers or the reporters or even the lawyers that break me most. It is the echo of her young voice, promising a love that no longer exists. Sometimes I wonder if she remembers making that vow, or if she has buried it beneath ambition and Ethan's whispered plans. Sometimes I wonder if she regrets it, even for a fleeting second. But then I see the way she looks at me now, eyes cold with calculation, lips curling into disdain when she calls me weak. That promise, once so full of light, lies shattered, and I am left to pick up the shards alone. The memory remains, not as comfort, but as proof of what I lost long before the courtroom ever opened its doors. After I found the Cresvale folder, I did what any careful teacher would do. I checked the ledger of my own life. I ordered my full credit reports, printed them page by page, and laid them across the dining table like a map. The first wrong turn appeared quickly. An online savings account I had never opened, created 9 months earlier with my Social Security number and my home address. A second account surfaced at a different bank, opened the same week. Then a credit card with an unfamiliar rewards program, followed by a money market account that listed retirement planning as its purpose. Each one carried my name, my birth date, my identity, as if I had split into versions of myself that wandered off to live lives I never approved. I went to my bank the next morning with a notebook and a calm voice I had practiced in the mirror. The branch manager, Ms. Patel, greeted me with polite concern. I asked to review any accounts that had been opened or modified in the past year. She hesitated, citing policy, until I slid my driver's license and a stack of statements across the desk. "Something is wrong," I said quietly. "Please help me see it." Policy bent under the weight of sincerity. She pulled up my profile and frowned. "I'm seeing a new online banking profile linked to your customer ID," she said. "It was created from a different email than the one you've always used. There's also a note that an authorized person was added to assist with transactions." I felt the blood move slowly through my body, like syrup. "Who is the authorized person?" She scrolled, then looked at me with a kind of gentle dread. "Ethan Hale." My son-in-law's name hung in the air between us. Ms. Patel turned the monitor toward me so I could see. The screen showed a scanned durable power of attorney, limited, granting transaction access for the benefit of the principal, Ulyssa Hale. My signature curved along the bottom, but not the way mine curves. The loop on the Y too tight, the cross on the H too neat. The notary stamp read, Dawn Kepler. Commission expires 08/12, 2 years before the document's date. I asked for copies. Ms. Patel printed them carefully and slipped them into a folder. Before she did, she clicked into the transaction history. There were transfers I did not recognize, small test deposits, then larger movements to an account ending in 2719. The memo lines read like coded scraps: Cresvale Ops, expansion wire, consulting fee. One line made my stomach harden. Aish Disp, Valerade Veterans Fund. I waited until I reached the parking lot to breathe. I sat in my car, the folder on my lap, and called the number listed for the descriptor. A recorded voice answered. Then a woman from compliance returned my call an hour later. She sounded efficient, almost kind. "Yes, Ms. Hale, I see 2 disbursements approved under your name for caregiver support," she said. "We have your applications, ID, and signed attestations. Funds were issued to the account on file." "I never applied," I said. "Please send me what you have." She emailed within minutes. I opened the packet at my kitchen table. There were 2 applications for the Valor Aid Veterans Fund, both approved. One described me as a caregiver to a veteran family, another as a senior facing financial instability. Both contained my scanned driver's license and an electronic signature. Contact information listed an email I had never used, and a phone number I recognized only because it had called my house 1,000 times, Ethan's. The disbursement account number matched the 2719 ending on my bank's printout. I followed the trail to a small regional bank known for business clients. Their logo appeared on a monthly statement addressed to a mailbox suite downtown. The name on the receiving account was not mine. It was Cresvale Group Holdings. I stared at the pages until the letters blurred. They had used my name to draw money from a fund intended to steady families who had already given so much. I thought of the veterans I had taught in night classes after their service, the men and women who flinched at loud doors and still showed up to learn. I imagined a family somewhere denied because my identity had been used to take what belonged to them. I called the regional bank and asked to verify the beneficiary information for the Cresvale account. The customer service rep could not discuss details, but she confirmed what I already knew without naming it. "The authorized signers are on file," she said. "One is the chief executive. There's also a deputy." Her tone softened. "Is there a concern about fraud, ma'am?" I thanked her and ended the call. I did not trust my voice to hold steady for one word more. I turned back to the Durable Power of Attorney Limited. The notary stamp called to me. I searched the state registry for Dawn Kepler. The commission number existed, but the expiration date printed on my document did not. The real stamp would have expired a year earlier. Whoever had prepared the paper either misread the record or didn't care to check it. Fraud rarely trips over truth. It trips over laziness. I needed corroboration. I drove to the mailbox suite listed on the bank statement. The lobby smelled of printer ink and stale coffee. A clerk looked up with a weary smile. I asked whether Cresvale Group held a box there. He glanced at the wall of brass squares and confirmed it. "Newish account," he said. "They come by late." My hands tightened around my purse strap. "Do you ever see who picks up the mail?" He hesitated, then shrugged. Then, "A tall guy, mid-30s, always in a navy jacket, polite. Sign-in reads E. Hale." Back at home, I laid the folder beside the credit reports. A picture formed with painful clarity. Accounts opened in my name, a falsified authorization placing Ethan at the center. Disbursements from a veterans fund routed into Cresvale's account. Clara's title, Deputy Director, appearing wherever the company asserted legitimacy. Every path led back to the man who had stood next to my daughter on the courthouse steps, his arm around her shoulders in practiced concern. I made myself a list as the room dimmed into evening. Call the credit bureaus, place fraud alerts, freeze new accounts, request all K-1s tied to Cresvale, meet with someone who could help me interpret what I was seeing. Each checkmark steadied my breathing. I moved slowly, deliberately, as if each action could hold me upright. Before bed, I looked again at the applications bearing my name. At the bottom of one, above the forged signature, a line read, "I affirm under penalty of perjury that all information herein is true and complete." I traced the fake curve of my name with my finger, then closed the folder. The house was very still. In that stillness, I felt a kind of resolve I had not felt since my husband died. They had borrowed my name to take money from those who had already paid enough. I could bear the harm done to me. I would not bear the harm done in my name. There was a time when my phone would ring with invitations to lunches, church gatherings, or book club meetings. People once called me for advice, for a recipe, or simply to hear my voice. But as the weeks of the lawsuit stretched on, the calls thinned out until the silence between them was louder than the conversations themselves. The silence became its own companion, settling into the corners of my house like dust no one bothered to sweep away. I first noticed it at the grocery store. Marjorie, who had sat beside me at Bible study for 20 years, saw me in the produce aisle and turned her cart abruptly, pretending to compare apples she had no intention of buying. I wanted to believe she hadn't seen me, that it was a coincidence, but when I called her name softly, she stiffened and pushed on without turning her head. The following Sunday, I walked into church and felt the air change. Heads dipped, smiles faltered. A pew where I once sat surrounded by friends remained empty until I slid into it alone. The sermon echoed off the walls, but the warmth I had always felt was absent. During fellowship afterward, no one reached for my hand. Conversations flowed around me like water around a stone, deliberate and unyielding. It was not long before I discovered why. Clara had been speaking, at first in whispers, then in statements dressed as concern. "I'm worried about Mom," she told Marjorie, who repeated it to Helen, who shared it with others. "She's been so forgetful lately. I think she's losing track of reality. That's why we had to step in." The words multiplied until they became a net that caught me wherever I went. At the post office, a clerk leaned toward me with exaggerated patience, repeating simple directions as if I were a child. At the library, the new volunteer offered to help me use the self-checkout, though I had done it myself for years. On the sidewalk, I overheard two women whispering, "It's sad, really. Clara says her mother sometimes doesn't even remember what day it is." The other clucked her tongue. "She's lucky her daughter is stepping up." Each time I heard these stories, my heart clenched in a different way. It was not just the betrayal of lies, it was the ease with which people believed them. Perhaps it comforted them to imagine age as inevitable decline, to accept Clara's performance as filial duty. It made them feel their own families would protect them when the time came. And so, with a few careful words, Clara isolated me more effectively than any locked door ever could. I tried to fight back quietly. I kept meticulous notes, writing down dates, conversations, even the weather, as proof that my mind was still clear. But notes in a journal do not change the way people look at you when they've already decided you're slipping. They smiled with pity, with the soft edges of superiority, as though humoring a woman who could no longer be trusted with her own story. One afternoon, I called an old friend, Lillian, who had been my confidant through widowhood. We had once shared tears over coffee, laughter over memories, hope over long walks. When she answered, her tone was guarded. "Yulissa, I can't get in the middle of this. Clara told me you've been confused lately, forgetting things. I hope you get the help you need." I tried to protest, to remind her of our years of trust, but she was already excusing herself, her voice polite but firm. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone in my hand, its silence as final as a slammed door. Nights became the hardest. I sat by the window and watched the glow of other homes where laughter still spilled through curtains. My house was filled only with the ticking of clocks and the occasional creak of wood settling. I remembered Clara's promise as a girl, her arms tight around me when I pawned my ring, her vow that she would never let me be alone. Now she had not only abandoned that vow, she had turned it inside out, convincing the world that I was already lost to forgetfulness. The cruelest moment came when I overheard a conversation at the pharmacy. Clara had apparently spoken to the staff directly. "Please watch out for my mother," she had told them. "She sometimes forgets her prescriptions, and I'm scared she'll mix things up." The pharmacist greeted me that day with an overbright smile and an offer to pre-sort my pills into labeled packs. I thanked him politely, but inside I burned. Clara had planted doubt so deep that even strangers managed my life as though I were incapable. I learned to move carefully, to keep my head high though the air around me thickened with judgment. I carried myself with the dignity I still possessed, even when others refused to see it. Yet inside, the ache grew sharper. To lose the trust of a community is one kind of sorrow. To have your own child dismantle that trust is another altogether. Still, beneath the loneliness, a seed of strength pushed quietly. If Clara wanted me cut off from the world, she would discover the danger of a woman forced into solitude. Silence sharpens memory, and memory, my true memory, was intact. I would keep every detail, every slight, every document, until the day came when truth would have its turn. The phone rang just after midnight, slicing through the stillness of my house. I jolted awake, my heart hammering as though I'd been running in a dream. The screen showed no name, just unknown caller. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but something in me knew it would not wait. I pressed the phone to my ear and whispered, "Hello?" The voice that answered was low and deliberate, every syllable sharpened by menace. "Stop digging. Stop looking. If you value your safety, walk away." I sat up straighter in bed, the sheets bunching around me. "Who is this?" My voice sounded braver than I felt. "You don't need to know," the caller replied. "But if you care about living quietly, you'll leave Cresvale alone. Close the files. Stay out of it." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, the dial tone echoing in my head like a scream. My hands shook as I set it on the nightstand. The silence of the house now felt hostile, every shadow stretched too long, every creak of the old wood sounding like footsteps. The next morning, I told myself it had been a prank, a cruel joke. But when I opened my blinds, I saw the car. A black sedan I didn't recognize sat idling across the street. Its windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. At first I told myself it belonged to a neighbor's guest, but when I returned from the market later that afternoon, it was still there. The engine purred softly, never off, never loud, just waiting. I began to notice it more often. Parked 2 houses down when I visited the post office, waiting near the pharmacy when I picked up my prescriptions. A shadow trailing me without ever stepping forward. Whoever sat inside wanted me to know I was being watched. I thought of Clara and Ethan, their careful faces outside the courthouse, their smiles rehearsed for cameras. They weren't just greedy. They were connected to something larger, something colder. The Cresvale files had hinted at it already. Shell accounts overseas, wire transfers labeled with abbreviations I didn't understand, payments routed through places I'd only read about in the news. Now the pieces shifted into a darker shape. This wasn't just family betrayal. This was business for people who thrived in shadows. One night, I gathered the courage to walk out to the porch and stare directly at the sedan. The driver's window cracked open just enough for me to see the orange tip of a cigarette flare, then vanish. My chest tightened. Whoever it was had no need to hide. They wanted me to feel the weight of their presence, to press fear into me until I broke. That evening, I sorted through the Cresvale documents again, searching for what might have drawn such attention. I found wire transfers to firms with names that sounded legitimate. Aquila Capital Partners, New Horizons Investments, but the addresses led to international financial centers notorious for secrecy. I may have been a retired teacher, but I could recognize patterns of laundering when I saw them. Ethan hadn't just forged my name to steal. He had tied it to a web that reached far beyond our small city. As I highlighted transaction after transaction, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. I froze, then answered. This time the voice was female, clipped and urgent. "Mrs. Hale, you don't know what you're walking into. They don't forgive curiosity. End this before it consumes you." Her words carried a note of fear, not just warning. Then she hung up. I sat in my chair for a long time, staring at the folder. The paper edges pressed grooves into my fingers. Every instinct told me to retreat, to stay silent as I always had. But the thought of Clara's name scrawled beside Ethan's on those documents burned hotter than fear. My daughter had stepped into something that would swallow her whole, and she was dragging me with her. If I remained silent, they would succeed, and I would be erased in more ways than one. That night, when I peeked through the curtains again, the sedan was gone, but the street felt no safer. I knew they would be back. The game had shifted. It was no longer just a lawsuit or a family betrayal. I was staring into the cold eye of something that crossed borders, something that lived in the shadows of money and power. And yet, for the first time, I felt my fear steady into resolve. If Clara and Ethan had tied my name to these networks, then my silence would not protect me. Only truth would. And I would find it, no matter who tried to stop me. There is an afternoon I cannot shake, an afternoon that returns like a song that knows every seam in the heart. Clara was 12, colt-legged, all elbows and promise, wearing a backpack too heavy for her narrow shoulders. She burst through our front door with the slap of wet sneakers on tile, cheeks blotched, breath shredded into uneven pieces. "Sweetheart," I said, but the word barely crossed the room before she collapsed into me. The impact sent me back a step. Her hair smelled of rain and pencil shavings. She tucked her face under my chin and sobbed with the desperate rhythm of a child who fears the floor has fallen away. I held her as if two arms around a shaking body could argue with the world. "They laughed," she choked. "They said I talk like a teacher, like I think I'm better. They took my notebook and passed it around. Someone said my dad being dead makes me weird." I felt the old ache open where her father should have been. "Kids are cruel when they don't know what to do with pain," I told her. "Cruelty is a language learned from fear." I guided her to the kitchen table, the place where injuries come to be named. I warmed milk on the stove, stirred in honey, and set the mug between her small hands. "Am I weird?" she asked, eyes too old for 12. "You are extraordinary," I said. "Extraordinary feels lonely until it becomes strength." She reached into the wreck of her backpack and pulled out the notebook. The cover was bent, a corner torn. I smoothed it on the table and taped the tear with the same care I use on old photographs. "There," I said softly. "Whole again." She took a long sip, then looked at me with a plea I still feel in my ribs. "Don't ever leave me." I brushed damp hair from her forehead and let certainty live in my voice. "I'm here," I said. "I'm not going anywhere." She pressed her palm to my cheek. "Promise," she whispered. "Promise you won't leave." "I promise," I answered, meaning it with everything I knew about love. We made grilled cheese and tomato soup because comfort often needs to be simple. We ate on the couch with a blanket across our knees. When sleep finally found her, her head rested in my lap, her mouth slack in the safety children know once the storm has passed. I watched her breathing steady and thought a life is built from small assurances repeated until they harden into foundation. That memory now lives beside another. The courtroom's harsh light, my daughter's voice steady and cold. "Burden," she called me, as if the word were a verdict and not the wound it is. When I set the two scenes side by side, the honeyed steam over a chipped mug, and the way she would not meet my eyes while a lawyer carved a story out of me, the ache becomes almost physical. How does the girl who begged me never to leave become the woman who walks away first? I try to be fair when I remember. I think of the messages the world pressed into her, the hunger to belong, the gospel of more, the lie that love equals usefulness. I catalog my own failings, the winter the pipes burst, the recital I missed, the nights I fell asleep in the chair. But inventory does not explain the coolness in her eyes or the ease with which she repeated a stranger's description of me to cameras eager for a simple story. Sometimes I open a drawer and find one of her old notebooks, a heart sketched in the corner, my name looped in bubble letters. I press my fingers to the page and wait for something besides loss to rise. I tell myself the child still lives inside the woman, that the part of her that ran home when the hallway turned cruel is not extinct, only buried. Hope is a discipline. I practice it like an old piano piece. At night, I remake our ritual in my mind. I pour warm milk into an imagined mug, stir in honey. I picture her older face in the chair where she once swung her feet, and I say, "Bring it here, the hurt and the noise and the bad advice. Lay it down." In the vision, her shoulders lift and sink, and the sentence returns in a new shape. Not "don't leave me," but something nearer to truth. I forgot how to come back. I do not know if she will. I only know the promise I made was real, even if it could not save us from this distance. She asked me never to leave. I did not. She left, and the leaving echoes through rooms that still remember her laughter. I do not polish that afternoon into perfection. We were ordinary people in an ordinary kitchen, trying to make something kind out of a hard day. Yet the kindness was real, and it is the measure I hold against the coldness that came later. I keep it like a light I can carry, always. I knew I could not fight this alone. My name had been dragged through the mud, my daughter had the community convinced I was losing my mind, and Ethan's hands were buried so deep in forged signatures and shadow companies that I could no longer untangle them without help. One night, I spread the folders across my dining table: bank statements, forged powers of attorney, the Cresvale records, and realized the fight had already outgrown me. If I wanted to reclaim my dignity and stop them from hollowing out everything I had built, I needed allies. Naomi was the first person I thought of. She had been one of my colleagues at the high school, teaching history while I taught literature. Years later, after a career change, she became an attorney. Though she retired a few years back, she still had a sharp mind and sharper instincts. When I called, she answered on the second ring. I hesitated, afraid she had heard the rumors, but her voice was warm. "Ulissa, it's been too long." I told her everything, about Clara, about the lawsuit, about Cresvale and the threats. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "Bring me the papers, tomorrow morning. We'll start there." The next day, I walked into her study, stacks of case law still lining her shelves, dust motes catching the light. She adjusted her glasses and leafed through my folder with practiced hands. "The signature is forged," she said without hesitation. "I can tell. And the notary stamp? Sloppy work. If they're bold enough to present this in court, we have leverage." She closed the folder and looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "You're not crazy, Ulissa. You're in the middle of fraud, and you won't face it alone." Through Naomi, I reached Samuel. He had served as a detective in the city police for decades before retiring to a quieter life. His hair had gone silver, but his eyes carried the steady weight of a man who had seen too much to be surprised anymore. Naomi trusted him, and that was enough for me. When I met him at the diner on Main Street, I laid out the Valorade Veterans Fund records, the bank transfers, the Cresvale accounts. His expression tightened as he flipped through them. "Valorade," he muttered. "I worked a case 5 years back. Similar scam. People using veterans' names to siphon funds meant for rehab and housing. We never caught the ringleader. Seeing this, I'd bet money Ethan and Clara are tied to the same network." He looked at me then, steady and deliberate. "This isn't just about you. They've been bleeding veterans' families dry using your name as cover. If that's the case, we'll find proof, and it'll blow the doors off everything." His words should have terrified me, but instead they steeled me. For the first time, I could feel the tide shift. The last piece came with David, a financial analyst Naomi had once mentored when he was a student. He had gone on to work with banks and nonprofits, known for untangling the most complicated money trails. When Naomi called him, he agreed to meet me in her study. I spread out the records again, tracing lines with my finger, while he scribbled calculations on a yellow pad. He worked silently for nearly an hour before leaning back. "They set up a lattice of shell accounts," he explained. "Money moves in circles to look legitimate, but it always funnels back to Cresvale. And here," he tapped a column of numbers, "payments disguised as consulting fees. That's where they're pocketing it. Ulissa, you're not just a guarantor. You're the keystone. Without your name, none of this stands. They needed you to make it credible." The words landed hard, but with a strange kind of strength. If I was the keystone, then I had more power than I realized. I wasn't just a victim. They couldn't operate without me. That truth, bitter as it was, meant I had leverage. Naomi closed the folder and looked at the three of us around the table. "We have enough to start building a case," she said. "But more importantly, you have allies now. Samuel will dig into the veterans' angle. David will map the finances. I'll prepare the legal framework. And you, Ulissa, you'll stay steady. You'll keep every record safe, every note clear. Together, we'll corner them." For the first time since the lawsuit arrived, I felt something close to hope. Not naive hope, not the fragile kind that shatters at the first blow, but a firmer ground beneath my feet. I looked at their faces, Naomi's calm resolve, Samuel's no-nonsense grit, David's analytical focus, and realized I was no longer carrying this alone. Clara and Ethan had tried to isolate me, to convince the world I was weak, unstable, finished. Instead, their cruelty had pushed me to gather people who understood truth, who would not be swayed by rumors or headlines. That night, as I locked the folder away in a fireproof box, I thought of the black sedan, the anonymous calls, the whispers in my community. They still surrounded me, but they no longer owned me. I had allies now, and with them, I would fight not only for myself, but for the dignity of every name Ethan and Clara had stained along the way. The breakthrough came one damp afternoon in Naomi's study, where papers had spilled across her dining table until it looked like the aftermath of a storm. Samuel sat hunched over a stack of printouts, his pencil tapping against the wood in a rhythm that betrayed his restlessness. David had his laptop open, scrolling through financial records with the intensity of a surgeon searching for a tumor. I sat between them, my hands folded to keep them from shaking. For weeks, we had been piecing together fragments, scraps of information that hinted at something vast, but never quite congealed into proof. That day, it finally did. David's eyes froze on the screen. "Wait, this isn't just sloppy accounting," he said. He angled the laptop toward us. "There's a second set of records buried inside these files. They're disguised as routine consulting expenses, but if you follow the timestamps, look here, you'll see a parallel column. It's a ledger." He printed it out, page after page, until the sheets formed a stack nearly 2 inches thick. Naomi leaned forward, her glasses sliding down her nose as she scanned the first few lines. Samuel stopped tapping his pencil. The ledger was meticulous, each transaction logged in coded shorthand. Transfers from Valerade labeled as VADASB. Payouts to foreign accounts masked under meaningless initials. Monthly kickbacks listed beside Clara's name. Ethan's initials scrawled in margin notes. My name appeared too, but always as the shield, UH Auth. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, seeing the cruel irony. My signature had been stolen, and now here was the record of every theft, laid out in careful handwriting. "This is it," Naomi whispered. "This isn't circumstantial. This is intent. Fraud, laundering, theft, documented in their own hand. With this, a judge doesn't just see suspicion, he sees a case." The ledger felt heavy when David placed it in my lap, the weight of paper somehow heavier than steel. It was strange how something so small could hold lives inside it. Mine, the veterans whose funds had been siphoned, the families left without aid. The handwriting looked almost casual, as though Ethan had never feared discovery, as though Clara had grown so accustomed to betrayal that she saw nothing wrong in signing her initials beside his. But possession of the ledger changed everything. For the first time, we had a weapon, instead of only wounds. Naomi's face sharpened with determination. "We'll make certified copies, keep the original sealed. This is the paper that will end them." Still, even as we planned, I felt the prickle of unease at the base of my neck. It had begun earlier that week, with the same black sedan idling a few houses away. Now there were other signs. A man at the grocery store who lingered too long in the cereal aisle, eyes darting whenever I turned. A jogger who passed my street at the exact same time 2 mornings in a row, never sweating, always glancing at my house. One evening, when I stepped outside to take in the air, I saw Clara herself across the street, half hidden behind the sedan. She was watching me. For a moment our eyes met. There was no guilt in hers, no hesitation, only calculation. She turned sharply and slid into the car, which pulled away without a sound. "She knows," I told Naomi later. "She knows we've found something." Naomi frowned. "That means she'll panic. And when they panic, they make mistakes." Samuel was less calm. "It also means they'll double down. If she's putting people on you, then this ledger is dangerous enough to threaten everything they've built. Be careful, Ulissa." Careful felt inadequate. Every creak of my house at night sounded like a footstep. Every knock at the door sent my pulse into a gallop. I began keeping the ledger with me at all times, tucked in a worn leather bag that never left my side. I carried it to the bank to place in a safety deposit box, then carried it back out again, unwilling to let it leave my sight. The weight of it was a constant reminder that I was both hunted and armed. One night I spread the pages across my own table, tracing the ink with my finger. I noticed something I hadn't seen before. At the bottom of the final sheet, scrawled hastily, were the words Q4 allocation, UH doc. The letters matched Ethan's hand. I realized with a jolt that this ledger was not just evidence. It was the very paper I had carried into the courtroom, the one that had made the judge rise to his feet and order the doors closed. It was all here, every crime laid bare in their own record-keeping, and I had been the one to place it into the hands of justice. The knowledge steadied me, even as the fear pressed closer. Clara might send cars, might spread lies, might try to corner me into silence. But the ledger was truth in ink, and truth has its own kind of gravity. It pulls everything else down with it. That night, as I locked the pages back into my bag, I looked out the window. The sedan was back, engine idling. I whispered into the quiet, not to them, but to myself. You can follow me. You can call me a burden. You can smear my name. But you cannot erase this, and you cannot erase me. The air in the courtroom felt heavier than any storm I had ever known. I sat at the defendant's table, my hands folded neatly in my lap, my face composed into the calm of a woman who had weathered far too many battles in silence. Across from me, Clara sat with her lawyer, her posture perfect, her hair brushed to a glossy shine. Ethan was just behind her, whispering from time to time, his eyes fixed on me with the steady malice of a man who thought he had already won. The judge entered, robes sweeping, and the bailiff called the room to order. Wood creaked as everyone rose and then sat again. I could hear the shuffle of reporters' pens against their pads, the faint whir of cameras adjusting their focus. This was no longer just a legal proceeding. It was a theater in which my daughter had scripted herself as the dutiful victim and me as the frail villain. Her lawyer rose first, a man whose suit fit him as tightly as his smirk. "Your Honor," he began, "we are here today not only to address the grave mismanagement of family funds, but to confront a tragic truth. Mrs. Ulissa Hale, though once a respected teacher, has declined in recent years to a state that can only be described as instability. She is no longer capable of understanding the consequences of her actions, and her daughter, Clara Hale, has bravely stepped in to protect what remains of their family's legacy." I did not move. I did not blink. His words hung in the air, poisonous and deliberate, yet I let them pass over me. Silence can feel heavier than any outburst, and I clung to it as if it were armor. Then Clara herself stood. She looked toward the bench with eyes that glistened artfully. "Your Honor," she said, her voice trembling as though weighted with sorrow, "this is the hardest thing I've ever done. I love my mother. I grew up with her as my hero. But she's not the same anymore. She forgets things. She confuses people. She once left the stove on all night and didn't remember doing it. I've had to answer calls from neighbors worried she was wandering at odd hours. I've tried to help, but she refuses every offer. It breaks my heart to say this, but she is no longer safe with the responsibility she holds. That's why I'm here." The courtroom murmured, sympathy rippling through the gallery. I heard it in the shifting of bodies, the soft sighs, the cluck of tongues. They believed her, because her tears looked real and her voice shook at all the right moments. Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it as if to remind the audience that this was love, not greed, that this was duty, not theft. I remained still. Inside, my chest tightened with every word, each lie cutting deeper than the last. Memories rose unbidden. Clara as a girl clutching me after a cruel day at school, Clara swearing she would never leave me when I was old. Now she painted me as a woman unfit even to be trusted with my own name. The lawyer continued, displaying carefully curated photographs of me in moments of fatigue, caught unawares. A neighbor's affidavit claimed I had once repeated myself in conversation. A pharmacist's note suggested I had been confused about my prescriptions. Each piece was laid out with precision, designed to form a portrait of decline. I listened to the narrative of my supposed madness, the careful architecture of deception, and I knew that any protest would sound like desperation. So I said nothing. The judge studied me over his glasses, his expression unreadable. I wondered what he saw, a mother betrayed, or an old woman crumbling beneath the weight of time. The gallery watched with breathless fascination, their judgments sharp as knives. The silence I maintained became its own kind of statement. Let them wonder if I was too broken to speak or too certain to waste words. Clara wiped her eyes with a tissue her lawyer handed her. "I don't want to take anything from my mother," she said, her voice cracking. "I just want to protect her. I want her to live safely, with dignity, without the burden of decisions she can no longer manage." Her performance was flawless. The courtroom leaned into her sorrow, into her rehearsed tremor, into the image of a daughter sacrificing comfort to save her mother from herself. And I sat there, silent, the ledger resting in my bag like a heartbeat, waiting for its moment. When the lawyer finished, he turned to the judge with a solemn nod. "We will show, through testimony and documentation, that Clara Hale has no choice but to seek control of the family assets. It is the only way forward for her mother's safety and for the preservation of the family legacy." The judge glanced toward me again, perhaps expecting a rebuttal. I kept my eyes steady, my lips pressed closed. Silence was not weakness, it was patience. I had lived long enough to know that truth does not need to shout to be heard. It only needs to wait for the right moment to be revealed. As the gavel struck to adjourn for recess, Clara leaned slightly toward Ethan, believing no one else would notice. Her sorrowful mask slipped for just a second, replaced by the quick gleam of triumph. It was fleeting, but I saw it, and in that gleam I knew her story would not hold forever. Because the ledger in my possession was not just paper, it was a reckoning, and when the time came, it would speak louder than all her carefully crafted lies. The judge returned from recess, but the room felt different. Clara's lawyer lifted his chin, ready to continue. I rose before he could speak. My chair sighed against the floor. "Your Honor," I said steady, "before further testimony, I ask the court to review a document." He studied me for a beat, perhaps remembering the portrait they had painted, an old woman unraveling. He nodded toward the bailiff. "Approach." I walked the aisle with my bag under one arm. I withdrew a single page, a clean copy from a longer record, and set it on the bench. It looked harmless, neat columns, initials in the margins. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. His eyes moved left to right, then slowed. He read the first line again. His jaw tightened. The hum of lights became the only sound. He turned the page over, found no trick, returned to the front. A finger traced a column labeled Remit, followed to a bank code, then to a country abbreviation no one here wanted to see linked to a family trust. He glanced at me, then at Clara. "What is this?" "An extract of Cresvale Group's internal ledger," I said. "Transactions drawn from my identity to accounts outside the United States. Valor-Aid funds appear here, routed as consulting payments. The initials identify approvals." He read again, faster now, connecting lines. Under Outh sat CH, under Exec, EH dates aligned with filings before this court. A memo carried a short phrase, UH Doc, as if I were a tool for every lock. His gaze hardened. He handed the page to the bailiff, who brought it to the clerk. She compared routing numbers against a sealed index, color drained from her face. The judge lifted his head. His voice sounded nothing like earlier. "No one moves," he said, each word a hammer. "Close the doors." Metal struck metal as latches fell. The gallery shifted into a low panic, the kind that makes people breathe too fast. Clara's hand found Ethan's, and for a heartbeat I saw truth crack across her face. Not grief. Calculation failing. Uniformed officers entered in a disciplined line. They did not rush. They did not need to. "Mrs. Hale," the judge said, "do you have the originating record?" "Yes, Your Honor. Certified copies and chain of custody." I passed the folder to the bailiff. He delivered it to the bench. The judge leafed through pages, stopping at transfers labeled Remit, ACPSIN, NHILU, VEX, BVI. He did not ask what the abbreviations meant. He already knew enough. He turned to Clara's lawyer. Were you aware your clients used the plaintiff's identity to move charitable funds to offshore entities flagged by federal regulators? The lawyer's mouth opened, then closed. Your Honor, we object to the character. Sit down, the judge said. Ethan leaned forward, whispering into Clara's ear. She nodded too quickly, as if speed could manufacture innocence. Officers split, one pair along the defense table, another toward the doors. Mrs. Hale, the judge said, softer now, thank you. For the record, the court acknowledges submission of Exhibit A. A captain stepped to the bench and spoke in a voice only he could hear. The judge's hand closed into a fist, then relaxed. He lifted the microphone. By order of this court, and pursuant to probable cause established by the evidence before me, detain Clara Hale and Ethan Hale pending federal review. Clara shot to her feet. No, she said, heat breaking through her practiced sorrow. This isn't... An officer reached her. Ma'am, hands where we can see them. Ethan stood too, muscle tensing, eyes darting for a hole that did not exist. Another officer intercepted him with calm firmness that brooked no negotiation. The sound of restraints closing was almost delicate, a click more felt than heard. In the gallery, someone gasped. Another whispered a prayer. I stood very still. I was not triumphant. A hollowness opened inside me, a room where love used to live, and now only echo remained. Clara turned toward me as they guided her away. For a second, the veneer fell, and I saw the girl who had once wept into my sweater after a cruel day at school. Her lips moved, barely. Mom, she breathed, fragile as smoke. What did you do? I didn't answer. The answer lay on the bench in black ink. The judge addressed the room. Let the record reflect that the court is coordinating with federal authorities. Court is in recess. No one leaves until instructed. The officers escorted Clara and Ethan down the aisle. Cameras tried to find their faces and caught a sleeve, the angle of a lowered head. The back door opened to a corridor that would end in fluorescent lights and forms. I sat down slowly. My knees trembled only when the adrenaline began to drain. Across the room, the clerk sealed the page into an evidence sleeve. She wrote the exhibit number in a neat hand, then looked up and met my eyes. It was a small look, the kind that says, I see you. I nodded once. The bailiff called the next instruction. The gallery shifted again, quieter now, chastened by ink and the finality of locked doors. I reached for my bag and then stopped. The most important thing I owned was no longer in my possession. It was where it belonged. It would tell the truth without me. As the officers tightened the cuffs around Clara's wrists, her head turned sharply toward me. Her eyes, once bright with rehearsed pity, now burned with something raw and unguarded. Hatred, yes, but beneath it, fear trembled like a bird caught in a storm. Her lips parted, and for a fleeting second her practiced mask shattered. Mom, she whispered, though the courtroom noise swallowed most of it. Then, louder, shaking, I didn't do it by myself. They made me. You don't understand. They wouldn't let me say no. Every syllable struck me like a stone. I had waited months for truth to show its face, but standing there, shackled and trembling, my daughter looked less like a thief and more like the child who used to run to me after nightmares. A flood of memories surged. Her small hand clutching mine when thunder rattled the windows, her voice begging me not to leave on the first day of school, her promise that she would take care of me when I grew old. And yet, here we were, with chains on her wrists and sorrow anchoring my chest. I met her gaze and did not look away. For once, there were no lawyers, no judges, no Ethan whispering poison into her ear. It was just us, mother and daughter, tethered by blood and broken by choices. Her face quivered with defiance, but her eyes were wet. Clara, I said softly, my voice carrying only as far as it needed to. You always had a choice. She shook her head violently, hair falling from its perfect frame. "No, you don't know them. You don't know what they hold over me." "I tried, I swear I tried. But Ethan said we'd lose everything if I didn't sign. He said it was already too late. He said—" Her voice cracked. "He said if I fought back, they'd come for me the way they came for you." The officers tugged at her arm, but she dug her heels into the polished floor. For one suspended moment, time bent around us. The judge's gavel sat idle. The gallery hushed, caught between pity and contempt. My breath came shallow, not from anger, but from the ache of recognition. Clara had not been the architect. She had been a pawn, groomed and cornered until she convinced herself betrayal was survival, yet betrayal had still been hers to wield. "I would have stood by you," I said, the words trembling in my throat. "I would have fought for you, even if the world turned against us. All you had to do was tell me." Her shoulders slumped as tears streaked her cheeks, mascara bleeding into black rivers. "I thought you were too weak. I thought you couldn't handle it." And the irony stung. She had mistaken my silence for fragility, when silence had been my strength. She had believed the woman who raised her was already broken, while I was still here, steady, standing. An officer pulled her toward the door, but she twisted once more, locking her eyes onto mine with a desperation I had not seen in years. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought they'd stop before it destroyed you." I wanted to reach for her, but my hands stayed folded in front of me. What could I offer? Forgiveness could not erase crimes, nor could pity undo the damage. But love, battered and betrayed as it was, still pulsed faintly between us, impossible to kill outright. The courtroom seemed to fade, leaving only her tear-streaked face and my aching heart. She was both my greatest pride and my deepest wound. And as the officers finally guided her away, I felt the weight of every year between her first cry in the delivery room and this moment of collapse. I sat down slowly, staring at the empty space she left behind. The silence pressed in, heavier than chains, but within it lived the truth. Love had not vanished, but it had been bent, twisted, weaponized, until mother and daughter stood on opposite ends of justice. And yet, even as pain hollowed me out, I knew one thing with unshakable certainty. This bond, though broken, would always be mine to carry. The storm did not end in the courtroom. It only shifted to the streets, the screens, the headlines that refused to sleep. By the time I stepped outside, the cameras were already waiting, their lenses like unblinking eyes that fed the world. Microphones lunged forward, questions layered over one another until they tangled into noise. "Do you regret turning your daughter in? Did you fabricate evidence to punish your family? Was this about revenge or justice?" I said nothing. My silence became a wall, and yet they kept pounding against it, hoping for cracks. When I reached my car, the flashes followed. When I reached my doorstep, the whispers of neighbors carried like smoke through thin walls. The next morning, the papers ran the story in bold black letters. "Mother destroys own daughter in courtroom scandal. Family torn apart by 50-member feud." Some shows painted me as a martyr of justice, others as a bitter woman who had sacrificed blood ties for a taste of power. On one channel, a commentator shook his head and muttered, "Family is sacred. Once you hand your child to the authorities, what's left of your soul?" On another, a veteran spoke in my defense, her voice steady. "Sometimes love means not protecting those who choose destruction." I brewed my coffee in the quiet of my kitchen and let the noise roll on without me. The steam rose, fragile and fleeting, like the certainty I once carried about who I was in my family. Now the world had decided it for me. Hero or traitor, savior or villain. The truth, I knew, was more complicated than they would ever allow. By afternoon, the controversy split into sharper edges. Online petitions demanded harsher punishment for Clara and Ethan. Another movement grew in parallel, outrage that Clara's father-in-law and mother-in-law had been spared prosecution because of advanced age and health concerns. People wanted their names on indictments, their signatures dragged into court the way mine had been dragged through every lie. Hashtags trended. Justice for all. No age excuse. My phone buzzed endlessly with strangers' opinions, with messages from people I had never met insisting they knew my heart. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street. Friends who had once called every week grew quiet. Some could not bear the scandal. Others feared association. A few wrote letters of support, telling me I had done what they never found the courage to do, hold family accountable. But even their kindness came laced with sorrow, as if they, too, believed I had lost something no verdict could restore. I did not answer any of them. Not the reporters, not the critics, not the defenders. Silence had carried me this far, and it would carry me through the aftermath. Words would only feed the fire. I chose instead to let the world argue itself hoarse. At night, the television flickered in my living room. Clara's face appeared again and again, her tear-streaked cheeks, her voice trembling as she claimed she had only wanted to protect me. Clips of Ethan surfaced, his jaw clenched in defiance, lawyers vowing to appeal. The pundits debated, spinning webs of speculation until even I, the woman at the center, felt like a stranger in the story. I turned the volume down until the voices faded into a low hum, and I sat in the stillness. The city outside carried on. Sirens in the distance, laughter spilling from a bar down the street, a dog barking in someone's yard. Life moved forward, indifferent to my scandal. Sometimes I wondered if silence was cowardice, if speaking once, just once, might reclaim something the world had stolen. But every time I felt the urge rise, I remembered the look in Clara's eyes when the cuffs closed around her wrists. The mix of hatred and regret, the confession that she had not acted alone. Nothing I said could rewrite that moment. Nothing could change the fracture that cut between us. So I sat with the silence. I brewed tea in the evening and watched steam curl like smoke from a battlefield. I folded laundry with deliberate care, as though smoothing the fabric could also smooth the jagged edges inside me. I opened the curtains each morning and let light fall into the rooms she once filled with her laughter. The world demanded answers, but I gave them none. Let them argue. Let them judge. My voice was no longer for the crowd. My voice belonged to me, and for now, silence was the truest thing I had left. After the noise of the trial had burned itself down into weary silence, I found myself standing in the middle of my kitchen one morning with a letter in my hand. It had come from a stranger, a veteran's wife, thanking me for exposing the fraud that had bled their savings dry. Her words were shaky, written on lined paper in blue ink, but they carried more weight than any verdict. She wrote that she had almost lost everything to the same schemes Clara and Ethan had pushed, that the money stolen had been meant for her husband's treatment after service. "If you hadn't spoken up," she ended, "we would have been finished." I sat there at the table for a long time, the light spilling across the wood, and I knew I couldn't let my story end with silence. So I began the Hale Foundation. It started quietly, the way all true things do. No press, no cameras, no grand speeches, just a room, a desk, and a list of names I had gathered from my months of sifting through fraudulent documents. Men and women like me, like my late husband, who had given years to the country only to be discarded or deceived when they came home. I wanted them to know someone was still watching out for them. Someone was still willing to stand up, even if it was just an old woman with tired hands and a scarred heart. I called Naomi first. She agreed without hesitation to help with the legal framework. Samuel put his badge away years ago, but his instincts were still sharp. He offered to track down any sign of fraud that crossed our desk. David, with his spreadsheets and sharp mind, volunteered to guard the numbers like they were his own blood. The four of us met around my dining table, drinking lukewarm coffee and sketching out plans on yellow pads. What began as an idea slowly grew into structure. The Hale Foundation's mission was simple: to protect veterans and their families from financial predators. We started with hotlines and free consultations. We partnered with banks to flag suspicious transfers. We built a network of volunteers who could sit with widows and explain in plain English what the papers in front of them meant. And slowly, a current began to run through the silence of my life. Hope, faint at first, then steadier. One evening, a young couple arrived at our door, holding hands too tightly. The husband walked with a limp, a cane tapping against the floor with every step. His wife carried a folder stuffed with letters and contracts. When she sat across from me, she whispered, "We think we've been trapped in something, but we don't know how to fight it." I opened the folder and saw it instantly. The same language, the same forged approvals, the same polished lies that had once carried Clara's name. The signatures cut into me like knives, but I kept my face still. This couple had been targeted by the very network I had helped bring down. They had been asked to sign away their small home in exchange for loans that never came, relief funds that evaporated the moment they hit their account. I looked into their eyes and saw the fear I had once felt in my own bones, the dread of being erased by people you thought you could trust. "You're not alone," I told them. "We'll take care of this together." Naomi drafted the filings within a week. Samuel tracked down the paper trail, each forged document linked neatly back to Cresvale's shadow. David compiled the evidence, every dollar accounted for, every signature cross-checked. And when the ruling came, the judge returned the home to the couple and froze the accounts of those who had preyed on them. The wife sent me a letter afterward. In it she wrote, "We thought we were finished. You gave us back our lives." I folded it carefully and placed it beside the other letter, the one that had started this journey. Together, they were more precious than anything I had ever owned. The foundation grew, step by step. We moved from my dining table to a modest office downtown. Volunteers filled the space with voices and the smell of strong coffee. Walls that once held only silence now carried charts, photos, and notes of gratitude. And in the evenings when the work was done, I sometimes stood by the window watching the city lights and allowed myself the rarest of luxuries, a smile. I knew I couldn't undo what had been broken between me and Clara. The ache of her betrayal still lived inside me, sharp and unyielding. But through the foundation, I found a way to transform that ache into something that mattered. Instead of letting bitterness rot me from the inside, I poured it into protecting others from the same harm. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about balance, about giving back to those who had been wounded not by war, but by the hands that should have offered care. In helping them, I was also helping myself, healing pieces I hadn't realized were still bleeding. And so the Hale Foundation became my new family, stitched together not by blood, but by choice, by shared scars, and by the stubborn refusal to be broken. The morning the letter arrived was quiet, almost too quiet. I had risen early, brewed a pot of tea, and let the sunlight filter through the blinds in thin golden stripes across my kitchen table. The mail sat in a small pile, mostly bills and flyers I had no interest in. But one envelope was different, plain, no return address, the kind of thing you almost overlook. I slid a finger under the flap and unfolded a single sheet of paper written in careful, slanted handwriting. "Dear Mrs. Hale," it began, "you don't know us, but because of you, our family is still whole." My eyes caught on that line, and already I felt something shifting inside my chest. I read on slowly, every word deliberate. They told me how they had nearly lost their savings to the same fraudulent network Clara and Ethan had helped build. The husband was a retired sergeant, the wife a school secretary. Their bank accounts had been drained by paperwork they thought they could trust, loans disguised as aid, signatures forged in ways too precise for them to notice. They had been a week away from foreclosure when the Hale Foundation stepped in. I traced the words with my fingertip, as if they might vanish. The letter said, "We thought we didn't matter, that no one would ever fight for people like us. But then you did. You stood when we couldn't, and now we know we are not invisible." I set the paper down and let my hands rest on it, trembling in a way I hadn't felt since the day of the trial. Tears blurred the edges of the page, though I hadn't meant for them to come. I had stood in courtrooms and stared down betrayal without flinching. But this, the gratitude of strangers who saw me not as a burden, not as an old woman past her usefulness, but as someone who made a difference, this undid me completely. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. For so long, I had carried the weight of being unwanted by my own child, of being cast aside as though my years of sacrifice had meant nothing. And yet here was proof, written in ink, that the love I poured into the world had not been wasted. It had reached someone. It had saved them. It had mattered. The tears came freely then, slipping down my cheeks in quiet streams. Not the bitter tears I had wept in the lonely nights after Clara's betrayal, but something softer, something that washed instead of burned. Healing tears. I pressed the letter to my chest and let myself feel its weight, lighter and heavier all at once. For the rest of the day, I carried it with me. I read it again while standing by the window, watching children on bicycles weave past the cracks in the sidewalk. I read it again before bed, the lamplight warm on the page. And every time, the same line stopped me. We thought we didn't matter. That sentence carved its way into my soul because it was exactly how I had felt, cast aside by the very people I had once believed would protect me. But these strangers, without meaning to, had given me back something my daughter never could, the certainty that my life still touched others. I folded the letter neatly and placed it in the drawer beside my medals, the same place where I kept my husband's wedding band and Clara's childhood drawings. It belonged there, among the pieces of my life that carried the deepest truths. When I turned off the light and sat in the dark, I whispered a thank you into the silence. Not to anyone in particular, but to the universe that had allowed this letter to find me. It was not my family who had reached out. It was not Clara or Ethan or anyone tied to the bloodline that had betrayed me. It was the voices of strangers who became, in that moment, closer to me than kin. And that was the quiet revelation. Sometimes, salvation doesn't come from those you expect to love you. Sometimes it comes from the ones you've never met, who carry your name on their lips with gratitude instead of shame. I fell asleep that night with the letter under my pillow, a reminder that even after everything had been broken, something precious had been rebuilt. Dawn meets the water with a kind of mercy only the sea knows. I walk the shoreline in a cardigan and old sneakers, the sand cool and packed where the tide just withdrew. Gulls skim the surface as if erasing yesterday. I breathe with it, matching my step to the hush before the day begins. This is where I come when the noise won't let me sleep. Out here, the world is stripped to its bones. Water, wind, a thin ribbon of land. No cameras, no judges, no headlines I did not choose. Only the steady metronome of waves, counting out a rhythm older than grief. I think of the courtroom doors locking, the sound like metal deciding. I think of Clara's voice, brave and brittle, and the paper I placed on the bench like a stone on a grave. I didn't feel triumph then, only the ache of something ending. Even now, with the air salted and clean, the ache is present, a familiar passenger who no longer tries to drive. There were nights I wondered what would be left of me when all the noise burned away. Was I only the woman people argued about on television? The mother who lifted a single page and watched her child carried through a door she could not follow? But after the crowd scattered and the headlines dimmed, there were small things that returned to me, the kettle's thin whistle, the citrus of a peeled orange. I learned the ordinary again, one quiet minute at a time. I keep walking. I carry in my pocket the letter from the family we helped keep whole. The paper has softened at the creases. Sometimes I stop walking and read it aloud into the wind, letting their words join the gulls. We thought we didn't matter. I know that sentence by heart. It reminds me that usefulness and worth are not the same thing, that love is not a ledger where the column of giving must always balance the column of return. Footprints appear and vanish beside me, pressed by strangers who walked before dawn and turned back home. I make my own line at the tide mark and watch the sea unwrite it. There is a lesson in that erasure. Not everything must be kept. Not every scar needs a witness. Some pains can be released the way the shore releases shells back to the water, not as surrender but as recognition. The tide will carry what I no longer need to hold. I think of the girl Clara was, legs all angles and hope, falling asleep with a half sandwich still in hand, trusting the world to finish gently what she could not. I think of the woman she became, Fear braided into ambition until it looked like certainty. Love did not save her from those choices, just as love could not excuse them. The ocean teaches me that too. Affection and boundary, held in the same body, wave and undertow. A piece of driftwood lies at my feet, its bark scoured to a pale smoothness. I pick it up and turn it in my hands. When wood floats in salt long enough, the sharp parts wear away, what's left truer to its grain. I have been in the water a long time. I have been changed, not ruined. Behind me, the world is already waking. A runner passes, offering a nod that needs no words. Farther down, a man throws a stick for his dog, both of them laughing with their whole bodies. The sun lifts, not dramatically, but with the confidence of something that has done this every day, even when we forgot to notice. I let its warmth find the slope of my shoulders, the soft fold of my neck. For years I thought courage sounded like speeches, like doors thrown open, like names shouted in rooms that did not want to hear them. Now I know courage sometimes sounds like the kettle in an empty kitchen, the scratch of a pen across a donor form, a phone answered on the first ring. It sounds like the footsteps of a woman walking toward the water before sunrise because she promised herself she would live, and then kept that promise with no witnesses at all. The foundation's number is saved in my phone. It will ring again today. Someone will need a form explained, a fraud frozen, a hand held steady while they sign their name. I will return home with sand on my shoes and make tea and answer, "Hello, this is Ulissa. Tell me what happened." We will begin again and again after that. Beginning is its own kind of victory. I forgive in increments. I forgive the part of Clara that was a frightened child. I withhold forgiveness from the part that chose harm. Both truths can live in me without argument. If the day comes when she wants to try a different way of being, I will meet her where consequence and love intersect. Until then, I let the ocean keep what I cannot carry for her. A single pelican drops like a thrown stone and rises with a silver flash in its beak. The world keeps providing, even when we are unready to receive. I whisper a thank you I cannot quite name. Maybe it is to the water for its constancy, maybe to time for moving forward even when I wanted to stop. Maybe it is to the woman I was, who stayed silent until silence became a blade and then a balm. The sun is high enough now to pull diamonds from the waves. I pause, close my eyes, and listen to the day arranging itself. I have been emptied and I have been filled. Both can be true. Some battles are fought in silence, and sometimes that silence is the loudest victory. The tide answers with steady breath. I turn back along the shore, my footprints already fading, and begin the walk home.